It's 1100 BC. A young woman quietly leaves her home in the mountains of Ephraim and begins a lonely journey back to Bethlehem. She is fleeing a man who calls himself a servant of God, a Levite, a religious leader. 4 months later, he comes to bring her back. What happens next will trigger one of the darkest chapters in biblical history, a chapter so horrifying that it nearly destroys an entire tribe of Israel. As night falls, the couple arrives at the city of Gibeah, a place that should have been safe, a city belonging to the tribe of Benjamin, one of Israel's own tribes. But after darkness covers the streets, a violent mob surrounds the house where they are staying. They pound on the door. They demand that the Levite be handed over to them. And then something unimaginable happens. Instead of protecting the young woman, instead of defending her, the Levite pushes her outside and leaves her to the crowd. All night long, she is abused. All night long, no one comes to save her. When morning arrives, she collapses at the doorway, alone, broken, dead. But the horror is only beginning. The Levite places her body on a donkey and returns home. Then he performs an act so shocking that it sends a wave of terror across the entire land. He cuts her body into 12 pieces, one piece for each tribe of Israel. Within days, 11 tribes gather for war. Brother turns against brother, Israelite against Israelite. Tens of thousands will die. Entire families will disappear. One tribe will come within a few hundred men of extinction. But here's the real question. How did God's chosen people become this violent? How did the nation that crossed the Red Sea, received the 10 Commandments, and witnessed miracle after miracle fall into such darkness? To answer that question, we must travel back centuries before this terrible crime, back to the origins of Israel itself, back to a cycle of rebellion, idolatry, war, and bloodshed that repeated generation after generation. A cycle that slowly transformed a nation, until it became almost indistinguishable from the very evil it was meant to destroy. This is the dark and disturbing story of the Book of Judges, and the shocking events that led to the birth of the Kingdom of Israel. Before we can understand how Israel descended into civil war, before we can understand how a nation chosen by God nearly destroyed itself, we need to go back almost 1,000 years, back to the beginning. Long before there was an Israel, long before there were 12 tribes, there was a man named Abraham. At the time, Abraham lived in Mesopotamia, one of the great centers of civilization in the ancient world. But according to the Bible, God called him to leave everything behind and journey west into an unfamiliar land called Canaan, a land filled with powerful city-states, competing tribes, and foreign gods. God made Abraham an extraordinary promise. His descendants would become a great nation, a people set apart from the surrounding world, a people who would worship one God rather than the countless idols that dominated the ancient Near East. At the time, that promise seemed impossible. Abraham and his wife Sarah were old and childless, yet eventually they had a son named Isaac. Isaac later had a son named Jacob, and Jacob's story would change history forever. According to the Bible, Jacob wrestled with God and received a new name, Israel. That name would eventually be given to an entire nation. Israel had 12 sons, and those 12 sons became the ancestors of the 12 tribes that would later dominate the history of the region. But before they became a nation, disaster struck. A famine forced Israel's family to migrate south into Egypt. At first, they prospered, but over time, their descendants became slaves. Generation after generation lived in bondage beneath the power of Pharaoh. Then came Moses, one of the most influential figures in human history. The Bible describes how God used Moses to confront Pharaoh, unleash devastating plagues upon Egypt, and lead the Israelites out of slavery. The Red Sea parted, the Israelites escaped, and a new chapter began. If you've made it this far, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Which biblical figure fascinates you the most? Abraham, Moses, Joshua, or someone else entirely? Leave a comment below. I read as many of them as I can, and some of the best discussions on this channel happen in the comments section. And if you're enjoying these deep dives into ancient history, consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously and allows us to keep creating documentaries like this. After leaving Egypt, the Israelites spent years wandering through the wilderness. During that time, Moses received God's law. These commandments became the foundation of Israelite society. They governed everything from worship and justice to family life and personal conduct. The Israelites were no longer simply a collection of tribes. They were becoming a nation. Eventually, leadership passed to a man named Joshua. Under Joshua's command, the Israelites crossed the Jordan River and entered Canaan, the land God had promised Abraham centuries earlier. The conquest was difficult. Many battles followed. Some cities fell quickly, others resisted fiercely. But over time, the Israelites established themselves throughout much of the region. Once the major campaigns were complete, the land was divided among the 12 tribes. Each tribe received its own territory. Each tribe was expected to help defend the others. Together, they formed a loose alliance bound by faith, ancestry, and law. But there was one exception: the tribe of Levi. Rather than receiving a large territory, the Levites were scattered throughout Israel. Their responsibility was unique. They were priests, teachers, and spiritual leaders. Their job was to remind the people of God's commandments and keep the nation faithful. In theory, this system should have worked beautifully. The tribes had their land. They had their laws. They had their religious leaders. And they had a shared history unlike any other people in the ancient world. But there was a problem. The conquest of Canaan was never fully completed. Many of the surrounding peoples remained. Their cultures remained. Their religions remained. And over the coming generations, those influences would slowly begin to change Israel from within. The foundations of a great nation had been laid, but cracks were already beginning to appear. And after Joshua died, those cracks would grow into something far more dangerous. Something that would eventually plunge all 12 tribes into chaos. After Joshua's death, Israel entered one of the darkest and most chaotic periods in its history. There was no king, no central government, no standing army. The 12 tribes existed as a loose confederation spread across the hills, valleys, and plains of Canaan. And slowly, something dangerous began to happen. The Israelites stopped remembering. They remembered the stories of Moses. They remembered the crossing of the Red Sea. They remembered the victories of Joshua. But memories fade quickly when new generations grow up in comfort, especially when they are surrounded by cultures that seem more prosperous than their own. Imagine being an Israelite farmer. Your crops are failing. Your children are hungry. Meanwhile, your Canaanite neighbor has abundant harvests. One day he invites you into his home and points to a small statue. "This is Baal," he says, "the god of rain. Worship him, and your fields will flourish." Suddenly, abandoning your faith doesn't seem so unreasonable. At least, that's what many Israelites began to think. And so a pattern emerged, a pattern that would repeat itself again and again. First, the people abandoned God. Then they worshipped foreign gods. Next, enemy nations invaded and oppressed them. In desperation, the Israelites cried out for help, and finally, God raised up a deliverer, a judge, a leader who would rescue the nation. Then the cycle would begin all over again. The first great example was a man named Ehud. After turning away from God, Israel fell under the control of Eglon, king of Moab. For 18 years, the Israelites lived under his domination, until Ehud devised a daring plan. He concealed a dagger beneath his clothing and gained a private audience with the king. Then, when the moment was right, he struck. The assassination triggered a rebellion that freed Israel from Moabite rule. Peace returned, but not for long. A new generation rose, and once again, the people drifted away. This time, the Canaanite king Jabin oppressed Israel. His military commander, Sisera, commanded hundreds of iron chariots. Against such a force, the Israelites seemed hopelessly outmatched. Then an unlikely leader emerged, a woman named Deborah. Deborah gathered warriors from the tribes of Naphtali and Zebulun and led them into battle. Against all odds, the Canaanite army collapsed. Its commander fled the battlefield only to meet his end at the hands of another woman named Jael. For 40 years, the land enjoyed peace. Yet even that peace could not break the cycle. Soon, the Midianites arrived. These raiders devastated the countryside. Whenever the Israelites planted crops, Midianite forces appeared and destroyed them. Entire communities hid in caves to survive. Fear ruled the land. That was when God called a reluctant farmer named Gideon. Gideon gathered 32,000 men, but God told him the army was too large. 22,000 were sent home, then thousands more. Eventually, only 300 remained. 300 men against an enemy force numbering well over 100,000. It sounded impossible, which was exactly the point. Armed with trumpets and lamps rather than swords, Gideon's tiny force surrounded the Midianite camp at night. When the signal came, they shattered their lamps and sounded their trumpets. Confusion swept through the enemy ranks. The Midianites panicked and began fighting one another. By dawn, the invading army was in full retreat. Once again, Israel was saved. But by now, a troubling pattern had become impossible to ignore. Each rescue was temporary. Each generation seemed to fall faster than the one before it. And with every cycle, Israel drifted further away from the ideals that had once united the 12 tribes. The judges could win battles, but they could not change hearts. And soon, even the leaders themselves would begin to fail. The judges could win battles, but they could not change hearts. And nowhere is that more evident than in the story of Gideon. After defeating the Midianites with only 300 men, Gideon became a national hero. The people were amazed. Many believed he should become king. For the first time, the tribes had found a leader strong enough to unite them. But Gideon refused. "The Lord shall rule over you," he declared. At first, it seemed like exactly the right answer. Yet what happened next is one of the strangest twists in the entire book of Judges. Gideon asked the people to give him gold from the spoils of war. The people gladly agreed. Soon, a massive amount of gold was collected. Then Gideon used it to create an ephod, an object associated with priestly worship. But instead of helping the people worship God, the object became a snare. The Israelites began treating it almost like an idol. A symbol slowly replaced the God it was supposed to represent. Gideon had rescued the nation, yet even he unintentionally helped lead it back toward spiritual corruption. And after he died, things became even worse. Far worse. One of Gideon's sons was a man named Abimelech. Unlike his father, Abimelech wanted power. He wanted a throne. He wanted to rule, and he was willing to kill for it. Literally. Abimelech gathered supporters and murdered nearly all 70 of his brothers in order to eliminate potential rivals. Only one escaped. The massacre shocked the region, but despite the bloodshed, Abimelech succeeded in declaring himself king. For a time. His reign quickly descended into violence, betrayal, and civil conflict. Cities revolted. Former allies became enemies. Eventually, Abimelech was mortally wounded during a siege. His brief rule ended exactly as it began, in blood. If you've been following this story, I'd love to know your opinion. Who do you think was the most tragic figure we've covered so far? Gideon, Abimelech, or someone else entirely? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. I always enjoy reading different perspectives, especially on stories as complicated as these. And if you're enjoying this journey through ancient history and biblical archaeology, consider subscribing to the channel. There's a lot more darkness ahead before this story finally reaches its conclusion. Unfortunately, Israel's decline was far from over. Soon another crisis emerged. The Ammonites attacked Israel east of the Jordan River. The tribes desperately needed a leader, and once again, they turned to an unlikely candidate, a warrior named Jephthah. Jephthah was an outcast, the son of a prostitute, rejected by his own family, driven away from his homeland. Yet hardship had turned him into a capable fighter. When the elders begged him to save them, he agreed. But before going into battle, he made a terrible vow, a vow that would haunt him forever. Jephthah promised that if God granted him victory, he would sacrifice whatever came out of his house first when he returned home. Perhaps he never expected the vow to matter. Perhaps he never imagined the consequences. But after winning a stunning victory against the Ammonites, he returned home to find someone waiting for him, his only daughter, dancing, celebrating, completely unaware of the promise her father had made. It is one of the most heartbreaking moments in the entire Bible, a victory transformed into tragedy, a leader entrusted with saving his people, making a decision that would define his legacy forever. And the chaos didn't stop there. Soon afterward, Jephthah became involved in a conflict with the tribe of Ephraim. The dispute escalated into civil war. By the time the fighting ended, 42,000 Israelites were dead. Not foreign invaders, not enemy armies, Israelites, killing Israelites. The warning signs were becoming impossible to ignore. The people were broken, the tribes were divided, and now even the leaders raised up to save Israel were contributing to the nation's collapse. The cycle wasn't simply repeating anymore, it was accelerating. And soon, a new judge would emerge. A man blessed with extraordinary strength. A man whose life would become one of the most famous and most controversial stories in the entire Bible. His name was Samson. His name was Samson. And unlike the judges who came before him, Samson wasn't known for wisdom, leadership, or military strategy. He was known for one thing: strength. Extraordinary strength. According to the Bible, Samson was chosen before birth for a special purpose. He was to begin delivering Israel from the Philistines, the very people who had dominated much of the land for years. God blessed Samson with supernatural power, the kind of power that turned him into a legend. But there was a problem. Samson could defeat enemies. He just couldn't seem to defeat himself. Again and again, he made reckless decisions. He pursued relationships with Philistine women. He ignored warnings. He acted out of anger. And whenever someone betrayed him, his response was usually violent. Very violent. One conflict led to another. One act of revenge sparked the next. Before long, Samson and the Philistines were trapped in a never-ending cycle of bloodshed. Yet despite all his flaws, Samson remained a terrifying force. At one point, he single-handedly fought and killed 1,000 Philistine warriors, using nothing more than the jawbone of a donkey. At another, he ripped apart the gates of an entire city and carried them away on his shoulders. Stories like these transform Samson into one of the most famous figures in biblical history. But fame and strength could not protect him from his greatest weakness. Her name was Delilah. The Philistine rulers knew they could never defeat Samson by force, so they chose deception instead. They bribed Delilah to discover the secret behind his strength. At first, Samson toyed with her, giving false answers, playing games, but eventually he revealed the truth. His strength was connected to a sacred vow he had kept since birth, a vow symbolized by his uncut hair. One night, while Samson slept, Delilah betrayed him. His hair was cut. The Philistines rushed in, and for the first time in his life, Samson was powerless. They captured him, blinded him, bound him in chains, and dragged him to Gaza. The mighty warrior had become a prisoner. Months later, thousands of Philistines gathered inside the temple of Dagon to celebrate their victory. Samson was brought out as a trophy, a defeated hero meant to entertain the crowd. But standing between the temple's massive pillars, Samson did something he had not done in a very long time. He prayed. One final time, God granted him strength. Samson pushed against the pillars. The temple shook, stone cracked, and then the entire structure collapsed. Thousands of Philistines died alongside the man they thought they had conquered. Samson's final act became his greatest victory. But here is what makes this story so important. After Samson died, the cycle that had defined the book of Judges began to break apart. Previous judges had rescued Israel and led the people back toward God. Samson did not. The Philistines remained. The people remained divided. And spiritual corruption continued spreading through every corner of the land. The nation was no longer simply struggling. It was unraveling. Soon, entire tribes would lose hope. Religious leaders would abandon their calling. Idolatry would become normal. And one horrific crime would ignite the bloodiest civil war in Israel's early history. The darkness that began generations earlier was finally reaching its climax. The darkness that began generations earlier was finally reaching its climax. And it started with something that seemed almost insignificant. A tribe that had simply given up. The tribe of Dan had lost faith that they could ever defeat the Philistines. Instead of fighting for their homeland, they abandoned it. They sent scouts north to search for an easier place to settle. Along the way, those scouts encountered something deeply disturbing. A Levite, a religious leader, a man whose duty was to teach God's law. Yet this Levite was serving in a household filled with idols, false gods, false worship. And apparently, no one thought there was anything wrong with it. The Danites eventually conquered a peaceful northern city called Laish. They renamed it Dan. Then they stole the household idols and persuaded the Levite to join them. An entire tribe of Israel had now built its future around religious corruption. The people who were supposed to be different had become nearly indistinguishable from the nations around them. It was during this same period that a Levite and his concubine traveled through the territory of Benjamin. The story you heard at the very beginning of this documentary. A story so horrifying that it still shocks readers today. After arriving in the city of Gibeah, the couple accepted shelter for the night. Then the mob came. The house was surrounded. Violence filled the streets. And by morning, the young woman was dead. What happened next sent shockwaves across the entire nation. The Levite carried her body home, then divided it into 12 pieces. One piece sent to each tribe of Israel. The message was unmistakable. Israel had reached a breaking point. For the first time in years, the tribes united, but not against a foreign enemy, against each other. 11 tribes demanded justice. The tribe of Benjamin refused. War became inevitable. What followed was one of the bloodiest civil conflicts recorded in the Bible. Day after day, Israelites slaughtered Israelites. Families disappeared. Entire communities were wiped out. By the end, the once powerful tribe of Benjamin had been reduced to only 600 surviving men. The survivors faced extinction. And suddenly the victorious tribes realized something terrible. If Benjamin disappeared, one of the 12 tribes of Israel would vanish forever. So they searched desperately for a solution. The result was yet another tragedy. More violence, more suffering, more innocent lives caught in the chaos. And then, after all the bloodshed, after all the idolatry, after all the betrayal and civil war, the book of Judges closes with a haunting sentence. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. That single line explains everything. The problem was never merely foreign enemies. It was never merely weak armies. It was never merely bad leaders. The deeper problem was that every generation had chosen its own path, and eventually that path led to collapse. Yet from this darkness, something new was about to emerge. The tribes would soon demand a king, a ruler who could unite the nation and restore order. The age of the judges was ending. The age of kings was about to begin. And from the ashes of civil war, the kingdom of Israel would finally be born. The story of ancient Israel is not a comfortable story. It isn't a tale filled with flawless heroes, noble victories, and happy endings. In many ways, it's the exact opposite. Over the course of the book of Judges, we watched an entire society slowly unravel. A people rescued from slavery. a people who witnessed miracles, a people given laws, leaders, and a homeland. Yet generation after generation, they drifted further away from the values that once united them. The most striking part of this story isn't the battles. It isn't Gideon's 300 warriors. It isn't Samson bringing down a temple. It's the gradual collapse of a nation from within. A collapse driven by division, pride, corruption, and the belief that everyone could simply decide for themselves what was right and wrong. By the end of Judges, the Israelites had become the very thing they were once warned against becoming. Religious leaders abandoned their calling, families turned against families, tribes turned against tribes, and the nation nearly destroyed itself. Yet perhaps that is why this story has survived for thousands of years, because it isn't only about ancient Israel, it's about human nature. The same struggles that existed 3,000 years ago still exist today. Power, greed, pride, fear. The temptation to place our trust in ourselves rather than something greater. And from that darkness emerged a turning point. The tribes would soon demand a king. First Saul, then David, then the rise of a united kingdom that would shape the history of the ancient Near East for centuries to come. But as we will discover in future stories, even kings would not solve all of Israel's problems. Before we finish, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Which story from the book of Judges shocked you the most? Was it Gideon's unlikely victory, Jephthah's tragic vow, Samson's rise and fall, or the horrifying civil war that nearly erased the tribe of Benjamin? Let me know in the comments below. I read every comment, and I genuinely enjoy seeing the different perspectives and insights you bring to these ancient stories. And if you enjoyed this journey through one of the darkest chapters of biblical history, please consider subscribing to the channel. It helps us continue creating long-form documentaries, exploring the ancient world, lost civilizations, forgotten kingdoms, and the stories that shaped human history. Thank you for watching. Until next time, remember that history is far more than a collection of dates and battles. It is the story of people, their triumphs, their failures, and the lessons they leave behind. This has been the dark history of the Book of Judges and the dramatic origins of the Kingdom of Israel.